Woohoo! After party time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Here, you go first.
Oh, okay. It just hit me now too. Oh my gosh. Yes, this whole uh, archaeology, geology thing is that's how I work. I just throw all this stuff in and then I extract. And then I throw more stuff in and I extract. And it's, I think the work I make would not have been, I would not have made that work if I'd stayed back east in New York and New Jersey, where I love dearly. I love New Jersey. I really do. I'm probably one of very few people to really admit that, but I do love New Jersey. But the work I've been able to make has been totally informed by where I live. I live with all of this erosion and change and rivers and blah, 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 all of that geological information. And that is how I make art. My process has been directly influenced by my physical place.
Now that we're in after party mode, where I'm going to turn the filters off, knowing all of this could get wiped out, let me say I will 100% agree with that, because I did one or two kind of cross-country road trips. I'm like, I have to have my Jack Kerouac years. And you really do. Your brain changes based on where you are. And I didn't love Buffalo. I didn't know that Buffalo, like New Jersey, could be a place I could love until I lived in Beaumont, Texas, which was within 6 miles of
until you go away.
And so when I came back, I was like, okay, no, I understand there are roots here and there are things that are super important. And I'm also, the reason I'm here is I'm taking care of an 83-year-old dad. And back to the piece, the word curation, I think, is really important, because you're talking about throwing at stuff and experimenting and being able to, what worries me, but also I might be interested in, is as the family archivist, when it's sold, it's an artifact, but the process of curation is the museum director has to decide what gets shown and what narrative may play out from that. So curation is this really important part of archaeology that you don't think about until you realize how much stuff isn't in the museum, or at least isn't on display, as far as I got it with that one.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I like to throw out, if you're both okay with a little bit of extra time, we'll keep rolling for a second, because I like to throw out like an extra question, sometimes involving like a creative process, just to get people's takes on like how they do things. So I think this has actually worked out pretty well, because my question for today, and I posted it on Instagram, I guess yesterday at this point, was how do you revise? So that was just a question on my mind this past week for a couple of different reasons, but just the idea of, okay, we got creating, and that was probably one of my questions in a previous session, like, okay, how do you get your ideas? How do you start? I think was my last one. But then also, that's the other side of the coin. How do you cut? How do you change? How do you revise, edit? I had a couple of responses which I can share from Instagram crew, but maybe somebody can offer a thought if you got a process, a practice, a method. I'll maintain that it's not a formula. I'm not a formulaic kind of writing person or editor, but there are tricks, there are patterns, there are things that work more times than not. So how do you revise? And I'll look up my my Instagram responses.
So for me, it really depends on whether I'm writing poetry or prose, and if it's prose, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Because for poetry, I tend to not revise nearly as much as I do with prose. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of my poetry is written on the spot and as a response or a reaction to things that happen. When I was 16, I wrote a poem that is now published in the Unoya Review. I wrote the first few lines at my mother's funeral, and I didn't really want to revise that much because that's what like made it so raw, the fact that I wrote it on the spot at my mother's funeral. So, in general, for poetry, I try not to revise too much because I think that can sometimes take away from the realness and the rawness of poetry. But for fiction, I also write novels and short stories and essays. I My favorite trick, and I saw quite a few people say this on Instagram, and I hear this all the time, but I think it's said often for a good reason, is I like to put it away and go back to it later and try to look at it with an objective point of view, almost as though I didn't even write it. Because I'm an editor at Beyond Queer Words, so I read writing every day, and I can pretty quickly sense whether or not I'm going to vote yes or no in whether it's going to be accepted at the magazine. So when I'm working on something, I like to put it away for a while and pretend that some total stranger wrote it and that it's a submission for a magazine. So that way I can really put my bias aside and really focus on what I can do to make it better. I also like to make sure that when I do make revisions that I'm still being true to myself, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, because there's this temptation, especially in modern days, to write what you believe will be successful or what will sell commercially. But I think it's important to kind of stick to yourself even when you are making changes. So yeah, in general, I try to limit my revisions, but obviously it's necessary, especially for longer projects like a novel. But yeah, I think that's my main thing, putting it aside for as long as possible and pretending you didn't even write it, which sounds strange, but it's worked for me.
Yeah, that's really helpful. A couple people said something along those lines. I'll try to get it accurate so I give them credit, but I think that's one of those methods is let it sit somewhere else. You're not engaging with it directly, but the ideas or the inspiration or the concepts, they're rolling around, they're steeping. And then when you do go back to it, the thing hasn't changed, but your ideas about it have maybe shifted a bit. So that's one thing. So that's great. And then the second thing I'll say is light touch. So that's I say that if I'm working with somebody specifically, my approach if I'm working with somebody else is I would rather have a light touch. You're the one who has the experience and the idea and where it's coming from and all that stuff that I don't have access to. So you're the one who's expressing it, and I want to learn about what you're trying to express, and then get to the accurate way, that you want to represent it. So I think that's there is something to that where you don't want to change too much when you're onto something. I guess that's when when you're onto something, and when you're just trying to slog through something. So thanks for that. I'll read a couple that I had from Instagram. One of them, friend of Wild Roof Journal, we'll get this one out of the way. Rachel, she said, "You know already. I just write the first draft all bad like, and then I make you read it," meaning me. So yeah, very funny. And then she has a maniacal laughter after that. So yes, I know. But serious point to that little joke, showing somebody that you trust, showing somebody that's willing to engage. We probably all have tried to give our writing to somebody who doesn't really want to deal with it. It's like, read this for me. And then they like, yeah, did you read it? Like, no. but having that back and forth, and I'll say I gave her stuff that I wrote that she gave me commentary on, so it goes both ways. Yeah, another one. I often revise as I'm writing, line by line, sentence by sentence, but I also put work away and return later. So we'll give that one Victoria. Victoria said that, but yeah, in terms of prose, that's probably something I align with a little bit more in terms of, okay, write a little bit, make sure that's on track, and then write a little bit more. And then I'll read a couple more later, but anybody else want to take this one up? How do you approach the cutting part, editing, revising, changing?
I just want to say I'm really, really impressed, Emma, that you pretty much don't revise your poetry, because poetry, I think, is one of the most courageous forms to create in. There is there's just nowhere to hide. There are so few words, and each and every word has such weight. And and it's patterning as well, right? There's that patterning going on, and that you're able to do that with spontaneity is it's very impressive. Um, so a question I would have is to have that level of confidence, because a lot of people would totally second guess themselves. How do you feel, or how do you feel that a knowledge of craft has allowed you to have that confidence and trust in your process and in yourself to create your poetry?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. I tend to see myself as actually not a very confident person. Confidence in both myself in general and my writing is something I've struggled with for a long time. But for my poetry, especially, I tend to really just spend a lot of time on each line as I'm writing it. And I can't move on to the next line until I'm very confident and set with the previous. So I sometimes will literally sit down to write a poem and spend an hour or more on an opening line. So the poem I was talking about earlier that I wrote at my mother's funeral, the first line is, "I ask that my sympathy be served without sugar." And I remember at the funeral, my theater teacher gave me a journal and a pen. And I decided, sort of on the spot, I'm just going to sit here. Everyone else is grieving in a more conventional way. So I'm going to sit here and write my journal. And it took me probably half an hour to come up with that line. But once I get the first line, I can really sort of just start rolling from there. But for my prose, I tend to revise after the fact, after everything's done. But for my poetry, it's very much every line needs to be perfect before I move on to the next. And I do think I have some confidence in my poetry, especially over the years after having more publications. And it's definitely, I'm trying to learn to be more confident without the direct validation of publications, because sometimes I have an author account on Instagram. Sometimes I won't even post something until or unless it gets published, but I'm working on being able to have that confidence. But the honest answer is that a lot of it is fabricated. But while I'm actually alone in my room at 3 a.m. writing poetry, I think a lot of confidence comes in the fact that nobody's watching me. There's this quote, I forget exactly what it is or who it's by, but it's write like nobody's watching because nobody's watching. And that really has helped me a lot, because obviously when I share something on the internet or submit to a magazine, it's going to be judged by people. But when I'm writing by myself alone in my room, nobody's watching me, nobody's judging me, nobody's there to say like, hey, that line sounds awkward. So I have confidence just because I my eyes are the only eyes that are judging my work. So that allows me to write more freely, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah. No, it does.
Yeah,
Thank
totally.
you.
Yeah, and a little bit of detachment or just a separation helps with that, if that is anything, just in the sense that, okay, this is done. And if you could say, all right, that's what it is, and I'm on to something else, then it's not really a matter of confident about it or not, but it's like accept it. That's what it is. Okay, take it. Not, I'm doing something else now, and not kind of looking at it as like, okay, this is like, I'm so invested in this, my whole identity depends on if people like it or not, and like I can't move on to something else if unless this gets accepted. So there is that kind of larger context, which I think is important. Yeah, I'll read a couple more from Instagram. As a former, or in a former auditor profession, I turned on word audio function to see how the narrative's read. So that's one thing I have not tried, is hearing it from an actual, in this case, an actual program, but maybe even another person reading it. I guess I have done that once or twice. That's good. Another one, that's from Anna. I'm sorry, Anna. Leave it alone for a bit, forget, rewrite it all. That's a little bit of a different spin on it. That's from Esther. In terms of, okay, rewrite it or put it aside and then just do it again. And then you can
Mhm.
compare, maybe merge if necessary, or use one or the other. And then one more from, didn't have a name on this one, but the account Rabbit in the Rain. Write it down, leave it a day or two, go back and edit language to make it a bit more concise. So that's one that gets to the cutting part of it.
I ask either Kathleen or Emma, have you ever tried the auto voice where it reads the transcription of your text?
Yes, I have tried that actually. I use that quite a bit. I like to picture, especially for my prose, that someone else is reading it. Like, even I think of like weird settings, like in a classroom or at a library. I have to picture somebody else reading it and it being an established work and thinking, do I still like this? Which maybe isn't the best approach, but I definitely like having it read out loud, also because I have severe OCD, so I need to hear it in order to know that I didn't mess up. But I actually do that all the time, yes.
Yeah, I only discovered this within the last 6 months, and everybody knows what it feels like to hear your own voice on a tape recorder. Oh, that's terrible. It sounds different in my head. But there was something uncanny, but also kind of liberating because I had handwritten something. It was kind of a prose poem, let's call it, and I figured out I could take a picture of it with my phone, and then it would read it back to me, and that was actually kind of great. There was a forced objectivity that I couldn't do myself. Oh, I'll put it in a drawer and I'll leave it alone, or have a friend read it out loud to me. Okay, but they're your friends, so they're doing something as they read it back. This was robotic, and you could kind of hear different things. It was like a little bit of X-ray vision, and I kind of loved it.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've never done it that way. The one thing I was thinking of on that point is like, even just in a small group setting like this, if we each brought a piece, and then somebody else reads it just in the workshop setting. So it is something the person who's reading is just seeing it for the first time, but they all are also trying to read it. And so it's not a great reading, maybe, unless you're maybe a better reader than I am, but it highlights, okay, this part flows, like there's no gaps in the reading. And then you get stuck maybe in a line or two that's a little clumsy. You bring out the points where, okay, that's wordy, that needs to like change, just because the person reading it and seeing it for the first time is getting caught up or just stumbling or something. It's not a perfect, I wouldn't, make all your changes just based on one reading, but it does highlight, in a workshop context, like, oh, yeah, those two words together, like that's a mouthful, like that doesn't really work. But on paper, when you're, putting words in a notebook, you can get a little bit carried away. So it makes that kind of more real and more tangible. And just that first reading thing was actually pretty enlightening for me, to actually be the reader, reading somebody else's thing, and then hearing, something I wrote read by somebody else for the first time. So that was pretty cool. So I would offer that one. But yeah, if you don't have that option, press play on your program.
That's really interesting advice to do that. If you don't have someone to do a table read or a group of people to share that experience with, just to have the device read it back.
It's not doing you any favors, but it's also not it's not stumbling over words. It'll mispronounce some things. You're like, all right, well, I get that. But there is a weird comfort in the coldness, the literalness of it. And part of your brain can say, oh, that didn't work the way I thought it would in my mind. And then another phrase will kind of unfold in a way like, yeah, that's probably not right. So it works for kind of sentence to sentence revision. Emma, you said you were working on some longer things like actual novels. That's where I fall apart. I got 2/3 of a novel rotting in a corner over here.
Still 2/3. You said that 6 months ago, Chris.
That's exactly right.
It should be 5/8.
Okay, so I went from 73.7 to 78.2 completion of the first draft, by the way. But I get caught up with revision in kind of the storyline, structural stuff. Emma, how do you navigate that? Because you got to kind of step back and zoom out. And I get into the second guessing thing Kathleen's talking about. Overthink it.
Yeah, I definitely second guess a lot, especially with longer works. I have a novel self-published on Amazon that I started writing when I was 14 and then published when I was 17. So I kind of wrote it throughout high school and then published it at the end of high school. And the plot of it is just very complex. It's magical realism. So there's both the standard plot elements and then the magical aspect. So I feel like whenever I revise a longer work, like a novel or a short story, every time I touch it, every time I make a change, I create a new plot hole. Like when I'm trying to fix one plot hole, I just end up creating 3 more plot holes, which is definitely frustrating. And I spent 3 years revising my novel before I published it. Literally, the first draft in 70 days, and then I spent 3 years editing it before I felt confident enough with publishing it. And I also worked with a professional editor, and he ended up telling me not telling me, but advising that I cut the entire final chapter, which was very difficult because it was my first novel. It was like my baby. But I listened to him. I accepted the fact, I'm a teenager. I'm a relatively new writer because I was 17 at the time. And I listened to him and I cut the entire last chapter of my novel, and it really hurt to do, but it ended up making it better, I think. After looking at it a few months later, I was able to step back and say, you know what, he was right, as editors often are. But I definitely think the revision process for novels is really interesting because, like I said before, you change one thing, and because it's such a long piece of writing, it affects a lot, and you have to go back to many different points throughout the novel. Even changing a trivial detail can end up being not so small or not so trivial. So I remember my dad telling me, my dad is a writer too, and he's my number one inspiration and supporter. And he told me at one point, after like year 2 of editing my novel, he said to me, you're just going to have to let it go at some point. Like, he said, I know this is so important to you. It's like your child, but you're going to have to let it go, or else the world is never going to see it. And it was difficult to do, but I eventually did let it go and accept the fact that, especially longer works, they're never going to be perfect, whatever that means. There's always going to be something that you look back and you think, I wish I did this differently. I wish I used a different word. I wish I didn't include this subplot, etc. But if you keep obsessing over it, then you're never going to be able to actually share your writing with the world. It's just going to stay on your computer.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, I was going to say there's
It's
something
not obvious,
for
that is an inspiration to somebody like me, who I wrote and said, finish a bad novel as opposed to try to write a perfect novel that never gets finished. So the fact that you've gotten this far at that young, that's amazing. I really
Thank
respect
you.
that. So good for you. Well done. I love it.
I was going to say there's something as far as genetics and writing. Mary Shelley, I think, was 19 when she published Frankenstein. So I think you beat her for her first novel in terms of age. Yes, and like I said, sometimes it's just, okay, it's done now. So visual art is maybe a little bit different because it's like, or I mean, something like drawing or painting, it's like physically there and you got to step away. And if you do something else, it's different. So yeah, I kind of see the loop of trying to change it and then something else changes later and you have to at some point just say it's finished.
Well, you have to let it go.
Yeah.
And perfection is unattainable, but completion is possible. And there's a quote, I just brought it up on my laptop, by the 20th century screenwriter Saul Sachs. The worst thing you write is better than the best thing you didn't write. And I tell my visual art students that the worst thing, that you paint or that you draw is better than the blank sheet of paper. Unless you're really doing a conceptual minimalist thing. Okay.
Yeah, right.
But then you have like a treatise to go with it. And I tell my students this, and I tell myself this as well, is to be reasonable about it. It may not be perfect, but be reasonable. Get it to be completed. Do another. Keep making. And I think for me, I mean, that's why I work in series, because I know that the one piece is not going to be able to express the totality of what I want to share and create about that subject. So there's a series of works, and each time, all of those iterations, I'm learning through each one. And that cumulative knowledge and experience, then as a whole, I get satisfaction from it. So working in an iterative way, in a series, is one way for me to address that revision question. Also, I think actually a body of work. I'd made it after a residency at the Morris Graves Foundation a number of years ago, and it was very nice. I did some really nice, they were lovely pieces. They were very nice, but they did not satisfy. And I was afraid to lose what I had. And I think for me, fear is the greatest limitation to my creativity. And so one day I just ripped them up. I just ripped them all up because it was like, hey, you're nice, but you're not doing it. It's not working here. So I ripped them up and I started playing with all the pieces. And that got me on a track for some of the most satisfying work I've ever created. So back to that, the work that we were discussing today about destruction and destroyer. that is a part of creation and of the creative process, is ripping it down and building it back up in a new and hopefully more satisfying and authentic way without fear.
Right. Yeah, I referenced a passage from Thich Nhat Hanh in the previous issue 13, and just that expression of composting. So I started kind of looking at it through that lens in terms of you're not throwing it away, you're composting it. So I mean that's a literal sense in terms of tearing something up and then using the pieces in another visual project. So yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks so much for your thoughts on the editing comment. We could probably keep going, but we'll end it here in terms of going on long enough and talking about our excellent pieces from issue 14, and then a little bit of extra in terms of some creative process stuff. So awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. Great talking to you. And we'll talk to everybody again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.